Highways are meant for speed and connection, but in a blink, they can transform into scenes of unimaginable chaos. Flames, twisted steel, and lives forever changed. Today, we're looking back at the 7 most tragic pileup crashes in U.S. history. Disasters so massive they still echo in memory. Stick around as we uncover the shocking numbers and heartbreaking stories behind each one. December 11th, 1990. Just after sunrise, Interstate 75 near Calhoun, Tennessee, should have been like any other morning commute. But instead of a smooth drive, the highway turned into one of the deadliest pileups in U.S. history. Out of nowhere, a wall of thick, soupy fog blanketed the road. Drivers who had been cruising at full speed suddenly couldn't see more than a few feet in front of them. Brake lights vanished in the mist, and in seconds, panic set in. It started with one crash. A driver, blinded by the fog, plowed into the car ahead. The impact was the first domino to fall. One collision led to another, and then another, until the sound of twisting metal and shattering glass echoed for nearly half a mile. When the smoke finally cleared, 99 vehicles were wrecked across I-75. Fires from leaking fuel lit up the fog, while the screams of the injured cut through the chaos. Survivors later described it as stepping into a war zone. 12 people never made it out alive. Another 42 were rushed to hospitals, many with devastating injuries. Some stumbled out of their cars dazed and bleeding, only to hear more crashes piling up behind them in the fog. First responders fought desperately to pull people from burning vehicles, but the zero visibility and constant explosions turned the rescue itself into a nightmare. Sarah Miller, one of the survivors, recalled the terror years later. "I slammed on my brakes as hard as I could when I saw those dim red lights ahead, but it was no use. The next thing I remember was a loud crash, and then everything went black." Investigators from the National Transportation Safety Board later confirmed the obvious trigger. Visibility had dropped to almost nothing in a matter of seconds. But the bigger mystery was why that stretch of highway was so vulnerable. Some pointed to the natural geography, the valley and the nearby Hiwassee River trapping fog. Others believed emissions from a local paper mill worsened the conditions. Lawsuits were filed, and the mill eventually paid millions in settlements. Though no single cause could ever be definitively proven, the disaster did force change. Tennessee later installed one of the nation's first fog detection systems, complete with flashing electronic signs, warning lights, and even barrier gates to shut down the highway. Cameras were eventually added for real-time monitoring, but for the families of the victims, those safety measures came far too late. The I-75 fog crash of 1990 remains a chilling reminder that sometimes nature holds all the cards, and human lives can be shattered in an instant. November 29th, 1991. The Friday after Thanksgiving, a day meant for family leftovers, holiday shopping, and long drives back home. On Interstate 5, just north of Coalinga in California's San Joaquin Valley, traffic was heavy but moving smoothly. Then, without warning, the sky turned brown. A violent dust storm, driven by 60-mile-per-hour winds and years of unrelenting drought, swallowed the highway whole. In seconds, visibility dropped to nothing. At 2:23 p.m., the first crash was reported. A driver, blinded by the swirling haze, slammed into the vehicle ahead. That one collision set off a chain reaction that would spiral completely out of control. In just 6 minutes, 33 separate accidents unfolded, tangling 104 cars, trucks, and tractor-trailers across a mile and a half of highway. Vehicles jackknifed, piled into one another, and some erupted into flames. Survivors would later say it felt like stepping into a war zone. Burning trucks, twisted wreckage, and bodies lying across the road. By the time the chaos ended, 17 people were dead, and roughly 150 more were injured. Some drivers were trapped inside their crushed cars for hours, waiting desperately for help to arrive. But rescue wasn't easy. Even firefighters, paramedics, and highway patrol officers rushing to the scene found themselves in collisions of their own. One emergency responder later said it was like trying to save lives in the middle of a sandstorm, mixed with a battlefield. Investigators quickly discovered what had fueled the disaster, a perfect storm of conditions. California was deep into its 6th straight year of drought. The farmland surrounding I-5 had been left dry and bare, with nothing to anchor the soil. When the fierce winds ripped through the valley, they carried massive clouds of dust directly onto the busy interstate. Combine that with holiday traffic, and tragedy became inevitable. Afterward, grief turned to anger. At least 34 lawsuits were filed against the state, with families demanding to know whether officials could have done more. Should the highway have been closed sooner? Could travelers have been warned? Millions of dollars were eventually paid out in settlements, but no amount of money could erase the horror of that November afternoon. In the years since, the Coalinga dust storm has become a case study in how weather and human vulnerability can collide with deadly consequences. California responded by installing stricter monitoring systems, emergency training, and modern warning tools. But even today, drivers in the San Joaquin Valley know that when the winds pick up and the air turns brown, they're facing the same invisible enemy that claimed 17 lives in 1991. January 19, 1983. A bitterly cold Wednesday morning in Stratford, Connecticut. The northbound toll plaza on Interstate 95 was jammed with commuters. Cars lined up in neat rows, inching forward to drop their change and move on. For dozens of drivers, it was just another ordinary moment on the Connecticut Turnpike. But within seconds, routine turned into catastrophe. At around 9:45 a.m., a tractor trailer hauling sweet potatoes and yams barreled toward the tolls. Witnesses later said it never seemed to slow down. Investigators would debate whether the driver, 37-year-old Charles Elletts, had fallen asleep at the wheel or whether his brakes had failed. Either way, the outcome was devastating. The massive truck slammed full force into the line of cars waiting in the exact change lane. The collision was explosive. 3 cars were crushed instantly. Fuel tanks ruptured, and a fireball shot into the winter sky. Toll collectors dove for cover as flames engulfed the booths and vehicles. The entire plaza shook from the blast. One survivor compared it to a bombing. There was fire everywhere, people screaming, cars stacked on top of each other. It felt like a war zone. By the time firefighters extinguished the blaze and pulled victims from the wreckage, 7 people were dead, including women and children. Several others suffered horrific burns and injuries. Among them was a young boy who clung to life for days on a ventilator before tragically passing away. His short life ended in the cruelest way imaginable. The truck driver survived and was charged with negligent homicide. His sentence, 6 months in jail and a $1,000 fine, was seen by grieving families as insultingly light. For them, no punishment could ever measure against the lives taken in an instant. But this tragedy did not fade quietly. Outrage spread across Connecticut as residents demanded action. For years, commuters had complained about the dangers of toll booths, but now the danger was undeniable. The Stratford disaster became the tipping point. Within 2 years, lawmakers dismantled all 8 toll plazas across the state. By 1985, toll collection on Connecticut highways was gone for good. The I-95 toll booth crash is remembered not only for the 7 innocent lives lost, but also for the sweeping change it forced. It proved that sometimes it takes heartbreak to push society toward reform. 7 lives ended on that cold January morning, but their deaths reshaped Connecticut's roads forever. January 19, 2009. A snowy Monday afternoon in Maryland. On Interstate 70 near South Mountain, traffic looked deceptively ordinary. Commuters heading home, truckers hauling goods, families on the move. No one could have predicted they were minutes away from one of the deadliest winter pileups in the state's history. By 12:30 p.m., the weather shifted. Snow began falling hard and fast, laying down more than an inch in minutes. Visibility plummeted, the pavement turned slick, and within moments, disaster struck. The first crash happened when drivers lost control on the icy road. That single wreck unleashed a brutal chain reaction. Car after car slid helplessly into the growing chaos. Tractor trailers jackknifed across lanes, blocking traffic like massive steel walls. Smaller vehicles spun wildly, smashing into each other as drivers fought desperately to brake. In less than an hour, more than 40 vehicles, including 35 cars and 5 big rigs, were tangled together in a twisted, smoking maze of wreckage. For those caught in the middle, it was a nightmare. Survivors described watching cars slide toward them like missiles, powerless to move. Engines roared, glass shattered, and the sickening crunch of metal echoed again and again. Some motorists were trapped for hours inside mangled cars as emergency crews fought through the snow to reach them. When the storm finally relented and first responders gained control, the toll was heartbreaking. 2 people had lost their lives. At least a dozen more were left with serious injuries, and dozens of others were hurt less severely. Washington County Hospital was overwhelmed as victims poured in, some in critical condition. Even rescuers weren't immune. Police cruisers and ambulances slid across the ice, nearly becoming part of the pileup themselves. Investigators blamed the sudden burst of snow, but another mystery lingered. Witnesses swore they had seen a brown minivan weaving recklessly through traffic moments before the crash began. Some believed it triggered the first collision, but the driver vanished and was never conclusively identified. Whether coincidence or catalyst, the questions around that minivan remain unanswered. The interstate was shut down for hours, traffic backed up for miles, and Maryland was left shaken. That winter alone, more than 400 people nationwide lost their lives in snow and ice-related crashes. The I-70 disaster was a chilling reminder that sometimes tragedy doesn't come from recklessness, but from a single snowstorm striking at the worst possible time. For survivors, the lesson was clear. When winter weather hits, caution can be the difference between life and death. March 13th, 2025, just before midnight, traffic on Interstate 35 in North Austin was crawling through a construction zone. 3 lanes narrowed down to 1, speed limits dropped, and flashing signs warned of delays. For most drivers, it was an inconvenience. For a handful of families heading south, it became a nightmare that would leave scars across the city. At around 11:30 p.m., a semi-truck thundered into the slowed traffic near Palmer Lane and Howard Lane. Witnesses said the driver never seemed to brake. The result was catastrophic. Cars and SUVs were crushed like tin cans beneath the massive 18-wheeler. In all, 17 vehicles were mangled together in a stretch of wreckage that spanned nearly 500 feet. First responders later described it as one of the worst scenes they'd witnessed in years. Flames from spilled diesel lit up the night sky, while debris and twisted steel blanketed the highway. Among the wreckage, crews made a heartbreaking discovery: tiny car seats belonging to children who never made it home. When the chaos cleared, the human toll was devastating. 5 lives were lost: 3 adults, a young child, and a baby. 11 others were rushed to hospitals, many with critical injuries. Emergency crews worked against impossible odds: fires burning, fuel leaking, and lanes blocked, yet still managed to pull survivors from the wreckage within 40 minutes. One paramedic described it as racing against time in a maze of burning metal. The truck driver was taken into custody at the scene and charged with 5 counts of intoxication manslaughter and 2 counts of intoxication assault. But when toxicology reports revealed no drugs or alcohol in his system, the case became more complicated. Was this negligence, fatigue, or was the construction zone itself, with its confusing signage and lane reductions, part of the blame? The National Transportation Safety Board launched an investigation, even deploying drones to map the scene and analyze whether the work zone design met federal standards. Meanwhile, grief turned to outrage. Families of the victims demanded answers, some pointing at the driver, others at the trucking company, and still others at the state for failing to safeguard one of Texas's busiest highways. Photos of burned car seats and crushed vehicles spread online, amplifying the public's anger. For Austin, the tragedy became a scar on I-35, a road already notorious for danger. 5 lives were erased in seconds, and while investigators search for accountability, one chilling truth remains: construction zones are danger zones, and a single mistake can destroy dozens of lives. March 13th, 2025. Afternoon traffic along Interstate 40 westbound near Williams was tense but still moving. Drivers were cautious, inching through stretches of road coated with ice from an ongoing winter storm. But just after 3:27 p.m., the weather turned ferocious. Snow whipped across the highway in blinding sheets, visibility collapsed, and within seconds the interstate became a death trap. The first sign of disaster came when a semi-truck jackknifed near milepost 159. The trailer swung violently sideways, blocking lanes and leaving oncoming drivers with nowhere to go. One by one, vehicles slammed into the blockade, sedans, SUVs, and other big rigs piling in with devastating force. By the time the chain reaction ended, 22 vehicles were tangled in the wreckage, including 13 passenger cars and multiple tractor trailers. The impacts ruptured fuel tanks, triggering explosions that sent fireballs into the snowstorm. Flames spread so fiercely that parts of the crash site burned for more than 20 hours. Troopers who arrived described a nightmare. Cars stacked on top of each other, smoke and snow swirling in the air, and an eerie silence as the storm seemed to muffle the chaos. When firefighters finally contained the blaze, the human toll emerged. 2 lives were lost: 35-year-old Juan Beltran Sanchez of Chino Valley and 62-year-old Evelyn Davis of Ganado. 16 others were injured, many rushed to hospitals with severe trauma. Some victims were pulled from mangled vehicles after hours of painstaking rescue efforts in sub-freezing temperatures. The Arizona Department of Public Safety launched a full investigation. Was the jackknife truck speeding, following too closely, or was it simply the storm's victim? The case grew even more tragic when investigators discovered additional human remains in the wreckage. Authorities began working to confirm whether they belonged to a missing family reported traveling through the area that day. The pileup forced I-40 to shut down for miles, stranding drivers in traffic jams stretching nearly 15 miles. For those trapped on the highway, it was a surreal scene, sitting in cars as blizzard winds rattled windows, watching the distant glow of fire rise into the snowy night. In the aftermath, officials urged caution on Arizona's northern highways, where storms can turn routine travel into catastrophe. That week alone, more than 2 feet of snow had fallen, creating lethal conditions even for seasoned drivers. The I-40 pileup near Williams now stands as one of Arizona's deadliest winter crashes, a brutal reminder that when ice, fire, and steel collide, nature often has the final word. March 14, 2025, a Friday afternoon on Interstate 70 near Goodland, Kansas. The highway was crowded with travelers pushing east and west across the wide, flat plains. For most, it was just another long drive under an endless horizon, but at 3:22 p.m., everything changed. The skies darkened, winds roared, and in seconds a massive wall of dust swallowed the interstate. Visibility collapsed to zero. Some drivers hit their brakes, others pushed forward blindly. That split-second difference sparked disaster. The first crash triggered a chain reaction, and soon 71 vehicles were tangled in a pileup that stretched nearly half a mile. Semi-trucks jackknifed across lanes. Cars were crushed between trailers. Metal screamed against metal as the choking haze swallowed everything in sight. Survivors recalled the terror, unable to see the hood of their own cars, surrounded only by the sounds of collisions and human screams. One motorist later said it felt like being struck by a wave of earth as dust pounded the windshield and vehicles careened in the darkness. Emergency responders raced into the storm, but the dust was so thick they described it as working inside a sandblaster. The wreckage scene was chaos. Twisted steel, broken glass, and lives trapped in mangled cars. When the dust began to settle, the toll was heartbreaking. 8 people had lost their lives, ranging in age from 20 to 72. Among them were college students, working parents, and retirees, ordinary people whose journeys ended in an instant. 46 others were injured. Many rushed to nearby hospitals with critical trauma. Troopers and firefighters worked for hours, battling the storm itself to free survivors from wreckage that seemed impossible to escape. The Kansas Highway Patrol launched a full-scale investigation. Were truckers following too closely? Did anyone drive too fast into the storm? Or was this simply an unavoidable act of nature? Investigators admitted what survivors already knew. In those moments, no one could see anything at all. The pileup shut down both directions of Interstate 70 for the rest of the day, stranding hundreds of motorists in miles-long backups. Families waiting in their cars could see only the flicker of emergency lights glowing faintly through the dust, a grim beacon of the tragedy ahead. In the aftermath, the victims' names were released. Fathers, mothers, sons, daughters. Their loss rippled far beyond Kansas, touching communities across the Midwest and beyond. The I-70 dust storm crash now stands as one of the deadliest pileups in Kansas history, a brutal reminder that on the open plains, when the wind rises and the horizon disappears, even the strongest steel and the steadiest hands are powerless against nature's fury.